Another interesting aspect of this park was the experimental farm that they had here, and they brought in this experiment, the Cattalo experiment, in 1916, and it was a joint experiment between the Parks Branch and the Department of Agriculture. And I think experimentation was happening in other places around the world at that time, so it wasn't unusual, but it is sort of unusual in the national park system, especially in a park that they're raising bison, and then, but I guess at the time it seemed common sense to have this experiment so close to the park since they were going to be crossing bison with domestic cattle. So it was quite an interesting experiment. It wasn't very successful. They bought an experiment out of Ontario. The Department of Agriculture brought it in, and the Parks Branch was overseeing it at the park, or assisting to oversee it at the park. And they crossed bison with domestic cattle, and they also, when that wasn't working, because they had several problems with sterility in the offspring, especially the males, and that was crucial to the experiment to work, to create this breed of cattle that, well, a breed of cattle that would be able to withstand the cold climates of Canada, but also be a hardy breed, have the hardy aspects of the bison. So they brought in yak from Banff National Park, because they had a yak herd there, because they believed this to be the intermediate species between the buffalo and the cattle. So they brought in the yak, but that also didn't work. So the experiment actually continued on until 1947, well beyond when the park closed, but it never was able to successfully create a viable herd of cattle. King's hide is here in the museum, and he was one of the most famous offspring from the experiment. The father was a bison bull, and then the mother was domestic cattle, and that cross often they didn't quit experimenting with it because it was considered a violent cross, they called it. It was quite dangerous. Often the offspring was born dead, and it was such a large animal that often the mother succumbed during when she gave birth to those cattle, because the offspring, because they were so large. So it was often termed a violent cross. And so they actually switched, and they would have the bison as the mother, and then the sire as domestic cattle from the domestic herds. But King was one of the results from the bison sire and domestic dam, and he was a very large animal, and there's pictures of him. He's twice the size of a car, and his hide is here in the museum, and it was just, he was basically one of these creatures that people would come and see. People would come to the park to see King, and I've heard many people say that they remember coming to the Cattalo enclosure and seeing King as a child.